I remember the weight of the auto pistol in my hand. Heavier than I expected. Heavier than it looked when Vex first handed it to me in the flickering darkness of our hideout 3 hours earlier. The grip was slick with moisture, not from the constant drip of toxins from the levels above, but from my own palm. Sweat mixed with the ever-present layer of industrial grime that coated everything in the underhive, creating a paste that made the weapon feel like it was trying to slip free from my fingers, even as I held it with desperate intensity. The body at my feet was still twitching. Small movements, involuntary. The nervous system firing random signals as it tried to comprehend that it was no longer connected to anything that could be called life. I watched the fingers curl and uncurl against the rusted metal floor, scratching patterns in the accumulated filth with fingernails that had been bitten down to the quick. Blood pooled around the torso, spreading slowly, following the slight decline of the passage toward the drainage grate 15 meters ahead. The liquid caught the light from the chem lamp mounted on the wall behind me, reflecting amber and sickly green in alternating pulses as the lamp struggled against its own failing power supply. The air tasted of copper and cordite. Beneath that, the familiar bass notes of the underhive, the smell that had defined every breath of my 16 years. Recycled atmosphere that had passed through too many lungs and industrial scrubbers, carrying trace elements of the chemical processes that kept Hive Primus functioning 70 levels above us. Corpse starch, machine oil, the acrid tang of the chem refineries in the adjacent sector where they processed Emperor knows what into compounds that were shipped upward to factories we would never see. And beneath all of it, the ever-present smell of decay, of organic matter breaking down in the perpetual dampness, of rust consuming metal in the darkness where natural light had never penetrated and never would. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and ragged, pulling air into lungs that burned with exertion, and something else, something I did not yet have words for. My heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm that felt too fast, too intense, as if it was trying to break free from the cage of bone that contained it. Every nerve in my body sang with an electricity that had nothing to do with the flickering chem lamps. I felt alive in a way I had never experienced in all my years of existence in the sump levels. The man I had killed wore the colors of the scavengers. Crude paint splashed across his jacket in patterns that marked his allegiance to the gang that controlled the territory 3 blocks south of ours. His face was turned toward me, eyes still open, staring at nothing with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been nothing at all. He could not have been more than 20 years old. Ancient by underhive standards, old enough to have survived things that killed most before they reached adulthood, but not old enough to survive me. I had fired 3 times. The first shot went wide, sparking off the passage wall and filling the narrow space with the shriek of metal on metal. The second caught him in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around and drawing a scream that echoed off the walls and ceiling before dying somewhere in the deeper darkness ahead. The third shot found his chest, and he went down like something with its strings cut, all coordination abandoning him in an instant. 3 shots from an auto pistol that jammed on the 4th trigger pull, the mechanism clogged with rust and the accumulated grime of decades of use and inadequate maintenance. 3 shots, and I had ended a life. Vex materialized from the shadows behind me, his augmetic eye whirring softly as it adjusted focus in the dim light. He looked at the body, then at me, then back at the body. His scarred face split into something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell with the way the left side of his mouth had been rebuilt with synth skin after a blade took most of his cheek 3 years back. "Clean work," he said. His voice was rough, damaged by breathing underhive air for 27 years. "Craze will want to hear about this." I nodded, unable to find words. My throat felt tight, constricted, as if something was wrapped around it. I wanted to speak, to say something that would match the enormity of what had just happened, but nothing came. Instead, I stared at my hands. They were shaking. Not with fear, I told myself. Not with horror at what I had done. They were shaking because of the adrenaline, because of the rush that was still flooding through my system, making everything seem brighter and sharper and more real than it had ever been before. "First kill," Vex said, and it was not a question. He knew. They always knew. Remember this feeling. Remember what it's like right now, because you'll spend the rest of your life chasing it. He moved past me, stepping over the body without ceremony, his boots splashing through the spreading pool of blood. He paused at the edge of the chem lamp's light, looking back over his shoulder. "You're one of us now," he said. "You're a rust jackal. You matter." The words hit me like a physical force. I matter. For 16 years I had been nothing, a runner for the gang, a body to send into the darkness to scout or steal or carry messages between territories, invisible, expendable. But now, with blood on my hands and a body at my feet, I had proven myself. I had crossed the line that separated the dregs from the enforcers, the forgotten from those whose names were spoken with respect in the flickering hideouts and passage gatherings. I looked down at the dead scavenger one more time, committing the moment to memory. This, I thought, was the beginning. This was the moment my life truly started. Everything before this had been preparation, survival, waiting. Now I was ascending. Now I would carve my name into the history of the Underhive, would become one of the legends that younger gangers whispered about in the darkness. I did not know then how many bodies I would stand over in the years to come. I did not know that the feeling Vex described, that electric rush of life and power, would fade with each subsequent kill until violence became nothing more than mechanical action, emptied of meaning and weight. I did not know that the names carved into Underhive history were forgotten before the bodies were cold. In that moment, standing in the flickering chem lamp light with blood on my hands and my heart hammering its fierce rhythm, I believed. I believed that this violence meant something. I believed that I mattered. I was wrong about everything. But I did not know I was wrong then. How could I? The Underhive was the only world I had ever known, and in that world the rules were simple. You belonged to a gang or you died alone. You proved your worth through violence or you remained nothing. You carved out territory and defended it, or you starved in the darkness with the mutants and the forgotten. This was Hive Primus on the world of Volg, 70 levels below the nearest point where natural light had ever touched stone or skin. 70 levels below the manufactorums where citizens worked 16-hour shifts assembling components for machines whose purpose they would never understand. 70 levels below the hab blocks where families slept in stacked coffin bunks and considered themselves fortunate. 70 levels below anything that could be called civilization. Down here, in what the Upworld called the Sump, we lived in the spaces the Imperium had forgotten. The lowest levels of the Hive, built on foundations that had been laid 10,000 years ago when mankind still remembered how to build things that lasted. Corridors that stretched for kilometers in absolute darkness, their chem lamps long since failed and never replaced. Chambers that had once served purposes now lost to time, repurposed into hideouts and fighting pits, and places where deals were made under the watchful eyes of gang leaders who had somehow survived past their 20th year. The walls wept constantly. Moisture from the levels above, filtered through kilometers of corroded infrastructure, dripped down in an endless rhythm that marked time more reliably than any chronometer. But this was not clean water. This was runoff from chemical processes and industrial cooling systems and the waste of millions of bodies packed into the hive above us. When it touched skin, it burned. Slowly, not with the immediate searing of flame, but with a persistent sting that left red welts and, over time, scars that mapped a person's years in the underhive across their flesh. I had lived here for 16 years. Every breath I had ever drawn tasted of recycled atmosphere and corpse starch, and the acrid fumes from the chem refineries 2 sectors over. Every surface I had ever touched was coated in the same layer of industrial grime, a paste of rust and chemical residue and organic decay that worked its way into the creases of your palms and under your fingernails and into the pores of your skin until you could never be truly clean. The smell was part of you. The taste of it on your tongue was as familiar as your own name. I belonged to the Rust Jackals, a gang that controlled 3 blocks of territory in the deep sump. 3 blocks might not sound like much to someone from the upper levels, but down here it was a kingdom. 3 blocks meant access to 2 functioning water condensers that produced liquid you could drink without immediate poisoning. 3 blocks meant control of a section of the old transit tunnel that still had mostly intact floor plates, valuable for moving goods without navigating the treacherous rubble of the lower passages. 3 blocks meant power, respect, the right to walk through our territory without looking over your shoulder every 30 seconds. The Rust Jackals numbered about 40 strong, though the number fluctuated constantly. People died. New recruits were brought in from the dregs who wandered the deeper darkness, desperate enough to swear loyalty in exchange for food and protection. The hierarchy was simple and brutal. At the top was Craze, our leader, a man who had survived to the age of 32 through a combination of viciousness and cunning that bordered on supernatural. His face was a map of scars, each one representing a challenge survived, a rival killed, a moment when death had reached for him and he had somehow slipped its grasp. Below Craze were the enforcers, the ones who did the killing when territory needed to be taken or defended. There were 8 of them, veterans who had proven themselves in the endless low-intensity warfare that defined Underhive existence. Vex was one of them, his augmetic eye a trophy from a raid on a dead tech priest's lair 5 years back. Before my first kill, I had looked at the enforcers with awe and hunger, wanting desperately to join their ranks, to be someone whose name was spoken with respect. Then came the runners, the scouts and thieves and message carriers. I had been a runner since I joined the gang at 12 years old. Runners were the majority of any gang, young and quick, expendable but necessary. We mapped the dangerous territories, stole from weaker gangs, carried word between allied groups. Most runners died before they reached 16. Ambushes in the dark, toxic spills in unmapped corridors, cave-ins in unstable sections. Sometimes they just disappeared, taken by the things that lived in the deepest darkness, the mutants and the changed who had given up on humanity entirely. Below the runners were the dregs, those who attached themselves to the gang but had not yet proven their worth. They did the work no one else wanted, processing corpse starch from the dead, maintaining the crude weapons we used, cleaning the hideout. They were barely better than the unaffiliated who wandered the sump alone, scavenging and dying in the darkness without even a gang name to mark their passing. I had joined the Rust Jackals 4 years ago, when my mother died of lung rot and my father disappeared into a press gang sweep. She had lasted 31 years in the Underhive, a lifetime by our standards, but the air down here eventually destroyed everyone's lungs. I watched her drown slowly over the course of 6 months, her breath becoming more labored each day, until finally she simply stopped trying to pull air into organs that had turned to scar tissue and fluid. My father had been a ganger too, though not a Rust Jackal. He belonged to the Steel Suns, a gang that controlled territory 8 blocks northeast of ours. But the Administratum had needed bodies for some war on some world whose name meant nothing to us, and they sent Arbite's enforcers down to sweep the Underhive for conscripts. They took every able-bodied man between 20 and 40 from 3 entire sectors. My father was 36. I never learned what world he died on, or if he even made it off Volg. The Imperium did not send reports to the Underhive about the fates of pressed gangers. With both parents gone, I had 2 choices: join a gang or die. The Rust Jackals controlled the territory where our habhole was located. Craze looked at me, a 12-year-old boy with nothing to offer but a willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive, and he nodded. That nod was the moment I became part of something larger than myself. The gang became my family. These killers and thieves and desperate survivors became my brothers. For 4 years, I ran messages through the darkness. I scouted territories and reported on the movements of rival gangs. I stole from the weak and brought my findings back to the hideout. I learned to move silently through passages where any sound might draw attention from things best left undisturbed. I learned which sections of the Underhive were stable and which were ready to collapse at any moment. I learned to read the subtle signs that marked gang boundaries, the scratches and paint marks that meant safety or death depending on what colors you wore. And I waited for my chance to prove I was more than just a runner. I waited for the moment when I could step up and become an enforcer, become someone who mattered in the brutal hierarchy of Underhive existence. That moment had finally come, and I had not hesitated. The blood on my hands was my initiation, my proof, my ascension. I believed I had found my purpose in the darkness 70 levels below the light. That purpose revealed itself 3 days after my first kill, when Craze summoned the entire gang to the central chamber of our hideout. The space had once been some kind of water treatment facility, its walls still bearing the faded stencils of Imperial Aquilas and maintenance instructions in a language that might have been low Gothic, but was too degraded to read with certainty. The machinery that had once filled the chamber was long gone, salvaged or simply collapsed into rust, leaving a space large enough for all 40 Rust Jackals to gather in the flickering light of a dozen chem lamps. Craze stood on a raised section of floor that might have once been a control platform. His silhouette was sharp against the amber light behind him, the scars on his face casting shadows that made him look like something carved from stone rather than flesh. He waited until every member of the gang had arrived, until the chamber was filled with the sound of breathing and the shuffle of boots on corroded metal before he spoke. "Brothers," he said, and his voice carried through the space with the authority of someone who had led through 3 decades of Underhive warfare. "We stand at a moment of opportunity. The scavengers have grown weak. Their leadership is divided. Their territory is vulnerable, and we are going to take it." A murmur ran through the assembled gang. The scavengers controlled territory adjacent to ours, 2 full blocks that we had contested for years through raids and skirmishes that never quite escalated into full war. But 2 blocks was significant. 2 blocks could change everything. Not just their outer corridors, Craze continued, letting the weight of his words settle over us. Not just their fighting positions. We're taking their core territory, the water reclamation plant on level 73, the supply shaft that reaches up to level 68. The chamber erupted in noise. Voices raised in excitement and disbelief and hunger. The water reclamation plant was legendary in our sector, a functioning piece of archaeotech that could process the toxic runoff from above into liquid that was almost clean, almost safe. The scavengers had controlled it for as long as anyone could remember, using it as their primary source of power and wealth. And the supply shaft, a direct vertical access point that reached 5 levels up, where the dregs of the lower manufactorum sometimes dropped broken equipment and discarded materials that could be salvaged and repurposed. This was wealth beyond imagining for an Underhive gang. Craze raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent. His authority was absolute, earned through decades of survival and the bodies of those who had challenged him. "This will not be a raid," he said. "This will be a war. We will move in force, take their territory block by block, and hold what we take. When this is done, the Rust Jackals will control 5 blocks of the sump. Our names will be spoken with respect in every gang from here to the sludge pools. Our legacy will be carved into the history of the Underhive itself." Legacy. History. The words resonated through me like the strike of a hammer on metal. This was what I had been waiting for. This was purpose made manifest. Not just survival, not just the endless scramble for resources and territory, but something larger, something that would outlast us. Our names would be remembered. The Rust Jackals would become legend. "I need 20 fighters," Craze said, his augmented eyes scanning across the assembled gang. "Veterans and blooded, those who have proven themselves, those who are ready to die for their brothers and their territory." His gaze found me in the crowd, held for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, then moved on. But I knew. I had proven myself. The body of the scavenger in the passage 3 days ago was my proof. I was no longer a runner. I was blooded. I was ready. When Craze finished selecting his assault team, my name was among those called. 20 gangers, myself included, were ordered to remain while the others dispersed to prepare defenses for our existing territory. As the chamber emptied, I felt pride swelling in my chest, pushing against my ribs with an intensity that almost hurt. I had been chosen, elevated, recognized. Vex appeared beside me, his scarred face showing something that might have been approval. "Told you," he said quietly. "You're one of us now." The assault team gathered around Craze, and he laid out the plan with the precision of someone who had fought 100 battles and learned from each one. We would strike at dawn, when the Underhive was at its quietest, when most gangers were sleeping off the previous night's chem intake. We would hit 3 positions simultaneously, spreading their defenses thin, then converge on the water reclamation plant. Speed and violence, overwhelming force, no mercy for those who resisted. After the briefing, Craze called me forward. He held something in his hands, wrapped in stained cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw a weapon that made my breath catch in my throat. A laser gun. Not the crude auto pistols that most Underhive gangers carried, not the rusted blades and improvised weapons that made up the majority of our arsenal, but a genuine Imperial Guard pattern laser gun. Old, certainly, probably looted from an Arbeits raid generations ago. The casing was scratched, and the power pack was held in place with wire and prayer, but it was real. It was power. "You've proven yourself," Craze said, placing the weapon in my hands. "Now prove yourself again. Fight for your brothers. Fight for the Rust Jackals. Fight for the legacy we're building in this darkness." I took the laser gun with both hands, feeling its weight, its balance. It was heavier than the auto pistol, but felt more solid, more reliable. I could see the manufacturer's mark still visible on the stock, worn but readable. A cog and skull that marked it as Munitorum issue. This weapon had been carried by an Imperial Guardsman once, had been pointed at the Emperor's enemies on some battlefield I could never imagine. Now, it was mine. That night, while the rest of the gang slept in scattered positions throughout our hideout, I stayed awake in a corner of the chamber, cleaning the laser gun with strips of cloth and the precious drops of oil we hoarded for maintaining our weapons. I worked the action, checked the power pack connections, sighted down the barrel at imaginary targets in the darkness. Each movement was a prayer, each careful cleaning stroke an act of devotion. I believed in that moment that I was preparing to do something that mattered, that the violence I would commit in the coming battle would serve a purpose beyond mere survival. That fighting for the Rust Jackals, for our territory, for our place in the Underhive was noble. That carving our names into the history of this forgotten place was a goal worth dying for. I believed that my brothers around me, sleeping in the darkness with their weapons close to hand, were worth any sacrifice. That Craze's vision of legacy and respect was real and attainable. That we were building something that would endure. The laser gun gleamed dully in the chem lamp light, and I held it with reverence, ready for the dawn and the war that would prove my worth. I did not yet understand that war in the Underhive never proves anything, except that violence is endless, and meaning is something we invent to make that violence bearable. But I would not understand that for some time yet. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn, in the perpetual darkness of the Underhive, we moved against the scavengers with the coordinated precision that Craze had drilled into us during the brief hours of preparation. The assault went well. Too well, I would think later, when I had time to consider what that might mean. We hit their first defensive position with overwhelming force, pouring through a junction point where 3 corridors met in a small chamber they had fortified with scrap metal barricades and overlapping fields of fire. But our assault was too fast, too focused. We were through their line before they could properly organize a response. I fired the laser gun for the first time in combat, the familiar whine of the capacitor discharge followed by the bright lance of red light that punched through a scavenger's chest before he could bring his own weapon to bear. He went down without a sound, and we were already moving past him, pushing deeper into their territory. The second position fell within an hour. The third before the chrono markers in our hideout would have registered midday. By the time the Underhive settled into its version of night, we had taken both blocks of scavenger territory and secured the water reclamation plant. 4 rust jackals dead. 16 scavengers. The mathematics of violence favored us completely. I killed 3 more people during that assault. The first was in the chaos of the initial breakthrough, a shadow that moved in the wrong direction and fell to a las bolt before I even registered what I was shooting at. The second was in a narrow passage where a scavenger tried to ambush our advance, coming at me with a length of sharpened rebar. I shot him twice in the chest, watched him fall, and stepped over his body without breaking stride. The third was during the final push toward the water reclamation plant, another silhouette in the darkness that my training and instinct identified as enemy. Each kill was easier than the last. The hesitation I had felt during my first kill, that moment of recognition that I was ending a life, faded with repetition. The mechanics became familiar. Identify target. Acquire sight picture. Squeeze trigger. Assess result. Move forward. It was a pattern, a rhythm, and I fell into it with a fluidity that surprised me. But something was different now. Details penetrated the combat haze that I had not noticed during my first kill. The third person I killed that day was younger than me. I realized it only after the body fell and I moved past, close enough to see his face in the chem lamp light. 14 years old, perhaps, maybe younger. His jacket bore the crude paint of the scavengers, but underneath it he wore a shirt that had been decorated with something drawn in what looked like charcoal, an aquila, the 2-headed eagle of the Imperium, rendered with the clumsy devotion of someone who had learned the symbol from faded propaganda posters and half-remembered teachings. He had been praying to the Emperor, I realized, believing that faith would protect him in the darkness. It had not. Later, during the push toward the water reclamation plant, I saw a woman trying to shield 2 children in an alcove off the main corridor. She was not armed, she was not a fighter, but she wore scavenger colors, which made her part of the enemy, part of the territory we were claiming. Someone's laser gun found her before she could pull the children deeper into the alcove's shadows. I did not fire the shot, but I saw her fall, saw the children scatter into the darkness, screaming. These observations lodged themselves in my mind like shrapnel, small and sharp and impossible to ignore completely. I told myself they did not matter. This was the Underhive. You killed or you died. The woman should not have been in a contested corridor during a gang war. The boy should have run instead of trying to fight. These were the rules, harsh and unforgiving, and I had not made them. I was simply operating within the reality that the Underhive imposed on all of us. I pushed the thoughts down, focused on the mission, on my brothers fighting beside me, on the victory we were achieving. When we secured the water reclamation plant, Craze posted guards at its entrance and declared it under his direct control. The plant would be rationed, he explained, its clean water distributed according to rank and contribution. The enforcers would receive the largest share. Then, the blooded fighters. Then the runners and dregs. I waited for him to announce that our new territory would benefit the entire gang equally, that this was a shared victory for shared gain. That announcement never came. Instead, I watched as Craze and his inner circle claimed the best positions in the captured territory, the chambers closest to the water plant, the sections of corridor with the most stable chem lamps, the access points that were easiest to defend. The rest of us were assigned to the outer positions, the places where the next counterattack would hit first. I also watched as the loot from the dead scavengers was divided. Weapons, ammunition, the few pieces of valuable scrap they had been hoarding. Craze took first choice, then his lieutenants, then the veteran enforcers. By the time the selection reached those of us who had been elevated from runners, the pickings were meager. A handful of rounds for weapons we did not carry. Blades too rusted to be reliable. Scraps. This was not the brotherhood I had imagined. This was not the shared victory that Craze had promised when he spoke of legacy and history. This was the same hierarchy of power and scarcity that defined everything else in the Underhive, just wearing different colors. But I pushed those thoughts down too, because something else had changed that felt more immediate and more intoxicating than any doubt. People knew my name now. When I walked the corridors of our expanded territory, younger gangers stepped aside to let me pass. They looked at me the way I had once looked at the veteran enforcers, with a mixture of awe and hunger and fear. I was blooded. I was proven. I had fought in the war that expanded the Rust Jackal's power from 3 blocks to 5. I mattered. When Vex passed me in the hideout 2 days after the assault, he nodded with genuine respect. "You fought well," he said. "Craze is pleased." Those words meant more to me than they should have. I felt pride swell in my chest again, pushing against the doubts that tried to surface whenever I remembered the boy with the Aquila tattoo or the woman shielding her children. This must mean something, I told myself. The respect, the recognition, the place I had earned through violence. This must be worth what it cost. I cleaned my laser gun every night with the same reverence I had shown before the assault. I practiced with it in the empty chambers, improving my aim, my reload speed, my response time. I was becoming what I had always wanted to be, an enforcer, a warrior, someone whose existence mattered in the brutal calculus of Underhive survival. The doubts were there, small and persistent, but I was not yet ready to examine them. The alternative was too terrible. If the violence did not mean something, if the territory we had taken and the brothers we had lost and the enemies we had killed did not serve some greater purpose, then what was any of this for? So I told myself that it mattered, that legacy was real, that carving our names into the history of the Underhive was a worthy goal. I believed it because the alternative was unthinkable, and I was not yet strong enough to think the unthinkable. That strength would be tested over the months that followed, as the reality of our victory revealed itself to be something far different from what I had imagined. 6 months after we took the water reclamation plant, the scavengers regrouped and launched their counter-offensive. They came at us from 3 directions simultaneously, hitting our outer positions with a ferocity born of desperation and rage. We held them off, but it cost us. 3 rust jackals dead in the first week, 2 more in the second. The fighting settled into a grinding stalemate, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Both bleeding fighters in skirmishes that accomplished nothing except to maintain the territorial boundaries we had drawn in blood. Then the Sumprats saw an opportunity. While we were focused on the scavengers to our south, they pushed into our northern territory, trying to take advantage of our divided attention. Craze was forced to split our forces, defending on 2 fronts simultaneously. The mathematics of violence that had favored us so completely during our initial assault now worked against us. We were spread thin, vulnerable. Every defensive position we manned was undermanned, every patrol stretched to cover too much ground. I fought in 8 major battles over the next 3 months. 8 times I stood in flickering corridors or ruined chambers and fired my laser gun at shadows that screamed and bled and fell. I stopped counting how many people I killed after the number passed 20. The faces blurred together. The details that had once lodged themselves in my mind like shrapnel no longer penetrated. Identify target, acquire sight picture, squeeze trigger, assess result, move forward. The pattern had become so familiar that it required no thought, no conscious decision. My body executed the movements while my mind drifted elsewhere, already numb to the reality of what I was doing. But I watched my brothers die. Thresh fell during a night raid on a scavenger supply cache. He had been a runner with me, had shared rations when food was scarce, had taught me which sections of the Underhive were stable enough to traverse quickly. A crude explosive, triggered by tripwire, caught him in a narrow passage. The blast threw him against the wall hard enough that I heard bones break from 10 meters away. He died screaming, and there was nothing any of us could do except keep moving forward because stopping in a contested corridor meant death for everyone. Jace took a lasbolt to the throat during the defense of our eastern boundary. He bled out in my arms while I tried desperately to seal the wound with pressure and strips torn from my jacket. His blood was hot against my hands, pulsing in rhythm with his failing heartbeat, slowing gradually until it stopped entirely. He had been 15 years old. I had known him since he joined the gang at 11, a scrawny child who had grown into a fighter I trusted to watch my back. Now, he was weight I had to leave behind because we could not carry the dead while fighting the living. Mara died from infection 3 weeks after taking a blade wound to her side. The weapon had been filthy, covered in the accumulated grime of the Underhive, and the bacteria it introduced to her bloodstream could not be fought with the crude medicines we had access to. I watched her fever climb over the course of 5 days, watched her sweat through the infection, watched the wound turn black at its edges as necrosis set in. She was conscious until the end, aware of what was happening, and her eyes held a terrible understanding. This was how most people died in the Underhive, not gloriously in battle, but slowly, painfully, from wounds that festered in an environment where everything was poison. One by one, the boys I had grown up with fell away, to bullets and blades and toxin traps and simple bad luck. The faces around me in the hideout changed, grew younger, less familiar. Half the gang was newer than me now, recruits brought in to replace the dead, and they looked at me the way I had once looked at Vex and the other veteran enforcers. With awe, with hunger, with the desperate need to believe that survival was possible if you were strong enough, skilled enough, lucky enough. But I saw something else in their eyes too, something that took me time to recognize because I had to acknowledge it in myself first. Emptiness, the same hollow exhaustion that had begun to replace the rush I once felt during combat. They wanted to believe that the violence meant something, that fighting for the rust jackals was noble and purposeful, but the belief was already cracking. They could see what I was beginning to understand with crushing clarity. The warfare never ended when we finally managed to secure our claimed territory, pushing the scavengers back to their original boundaries and forcing the sump rats to withdraw from our northern blocks. I expected a pause, a moment to rest, to rebuild, to simply exist without the constant threat of battle. Instead, 3 days after we stabilized our lines, Craze called another gathering in the central chamber. The bone collectors control 2 blocks southwest of here, he announced, his scarred face showing the same hunger I remembered from 6 months ago. They're weak, divided. This is our opportunity to expand again. The pattern revealed itself with terrible clarity. There would be no peace, no moment when we could simply hold what we had and live. The gang structure required constant warfare to maintain itself. Loyalty was earned through shared combat. Hierarchy was reinforced through the distribution of resources taken from enemies. The respect that kept Craze in power depended on him leading us to victories, and victory meant expansion, which meant more warfare, which meant more death. We were not building a legacy. We were feeding a machine that consumed lives and produced nothing except the continuation of its own grinding operation. I was 20 years old now, ancient by Underhive standards. 4 years ago I had been a runner, desperate to prove myself, believing that violence in service of the gang was noble. Now I was a veteran enforcer, and the young gangers who had joined after our expansion looked to me for guidance and inspiration. When I walked the corridors, they stepped aside with the same mixture of respect and hunger that I had once shown to those older than me. But when I looked at them, I saw myself at 16. I saw the belief that had not yet been ground away by the reality of what gang warfare actually meant. I saw the faith that violence served a purpose, that territory mattered, that names could be carved into history. And I knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in my chest, that most of them would be dead within a year. Their bodies would join Thresh and Jace and Mara, and all the others whose names I struggled to remember now despite having fought beside them. The violence that had once made me feel alive now just made me feel tired. The laser gun I cleaned each night with such reverence had become simply a tool, no different from the blade I carried or the rebreather I wore in the deep sections. The respect I had earned felt hollow, meaningless, because I understood now what it actually represented. I had survived. That was all. Not through any particular nobility or purpose, but through a combination of skill and luck that would eventually run out. I still fought when Craze commanded. I still defended our territory and killed our enemies. But the faith was gone, burned away by months of grinding warfare that accomplished nothing except to maintain the structures of power that benefited those at the top while consuming those at the bottom. And in the darkness of the Underhive, faith was the only thing that made survival bearable. Without faith, there was only the grinding rhythm of survival. Wake, fight, sleep if you could. Repeat until a bullet or blade or bad luck found you. I went through the motions, followed orders, killed when necessary. But the hollowness inside me grew larger with each passing day, a void that no amount of violence could fill. Then something happened that had not occurred in the 6 years since I joined the Rust Jackals. Someone from above came down to the Underhive. The word spread through our territory like fire through promethium fumes. An administratum official was descending. With Arbites, full enforcement contingent, every gang in the sector received the same message, delivered by servo skulls that drifted through the corridors broadcasting in High Gothic that most of us could barely understand. But the meaning was clear enough. The Imperium required something from us, and refusal was not an option. We gathered in the central chamber, all 43 Rust Jackals who remained after 6 months of constant warfare. The new recruits looked terrified. The veterans looked grim. Craze's scarred face was unreadable, but I could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his augmented eye whirred constantly as it processed information and calculated responses. The administratum official arrived with an escort of 12 Arbites in full riot gear. Their carapace armor was pristine, unmarked by the grime that coated everything in the Underhive. Their shock mauls hummed with barely contained energy, and their shotguns were loaded with executioner rounds designed to pacify crowds through overwhelming violence. They moved through our hideout with the casual confidence of people who knew they could kill everyone present without breaking stride. The official himself was thin and pale, his skin the color of corpse starch, his augmetic eyes glowing with a sickly green light. He wore robes that must have been red once but had faded to a brown the color of dried blood. When he spoke, his voice was amplified by a voxcaster implanted in his throat, filling the chamber with words that echoed off the walls. By order of the planetary governor, and in service to the God Emperor of mankind, he intoned, the Astra Militarum requires soldiers for the defense of the Imperium. Each gang will provide a tithe of fighters. Those selected will be granted the honor of serving in the Imperial Guard. Refusal will result in complete pacification of this sector. The meaning of that last word was clear. Pacification meant death. The Arbites would sweep through the Underhive and kill everything that moved until compliance was achieved. This was not a request. This was a command backed by the full force of Imperial law. Craze stepped forward, his posture submissive in a way I had never seen before. "We are honored to serve the Emperor," he said, and even his scarred face could not completely hide the calculation in his eyes. "The Rust Jackals will provide our finest fighters." But the administratum official raised a hand, silencing him. "You misunderstand. The selection will not be made by you. The Imperium requires soldiers who can survive. Veterans. Those who have proven their capability through continued existence." My stomach dropped. I understood immediately what that meant. Craze had been planning to offer up the dregs, the weak, those who had displeased him or failed to prove their worth. He would frame it as an honor while ridding himself of burdens. But the official knew gang politics. He would not accept cannon fodder dressed as warriors. The official walked through our ranks, his augmetic eyes scanning each of us with mechanical precision. When he passed me, those green lenses focused on my face for a long moment. I felt something crawl across my skin, like insects made of electricity. Some kind of scanning beam, analyzing, cataloging, measuring my worth by metrics I could not comprehend. He selected 15 of us, all veterans, all blooded fighters who had survived multiple engagements. Vex was chosen. So was Keller, who had been with the gang for 7 years. 3 others I recognized as enforcers who had fought in the assault on scavenger territory. And me. "You will be collected in 5 days," the official announced. "Prepare yourselves. You serve the Emperor now." Then he left, his Arbites escort surrounding him as they ascended back toward the levels above. The servo skulls lingered for a moment, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare at us with mechanical judgment, before they too drifted away into the darkness. The chamber erupted in voices, fear and anger and confusion blending together into a noise that hurt to hear. But I felt none of those things. Instead, I felt something I had not expected. Curiosity. For the first time in my 20 years of life, I would leave the Underhive. I would see the levels above. I would see the sky. Part of me had always wondered what existed in that world above the world, the place where natural light touched stone, where the air was not poison, where people lived according to rules and structures I could not imagine. Maybe, I thought, This was actually escape. Maybe the Imperial Guard would give my violence actual purpose. Maybe fighting for the Imperium would mean something that fighting for gang territory never had. I allowed myself to feel something approaching hope. That night, Craze called me to his private chamber. The space was larger than any other in the hideout, furnished with salvaged furniture and lit by chem lamps that actually functioned properly. He gestured for me to sit, then poured 2 measures of liquid from a bottle that looked like actual alcohol, rather than the toxic brew most gangers drank. "You think this is an opportunity?" he said. It was not a question. I did not deny it. "I'll see the sky." Craze laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You'll see the sky for maybe an hour before they load you into a transport ship and ship you to whatever war zone needs bodies. Do you know what happens to press-ganged soldiers? Do you know why the Administratum comes to the Underhive for conscripts?" I waited. Some part of me already knew what he was going to say. "They don't train Underhive scum," Craze said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "They give you a laser gun and point you at the enemy. You're not soldiers, you're meat. Bullets and shells that would kill trained guardsmen kill you instead. Most of you will die in your first battle. The ones who survive that might make it to a second. Almost none of you will see a third." The hope I had allowed myself to feel crumbled like rust-weakened metal. Of course this was not escape. Of course this was not ascension to something better. It was the same trap wearing different colors, the same grinding machine that consumed lives and produced nothing except the continuation of its own operation. The violence would not end. It would just change location. "Drink," Craze said, pushing the measure of alcohol toward me. "You'll need it for what comes next." I drank. The liquid burned going down, but it was a clean burn, not the corrosive fire of Underhive rot gut. Even Craze's alcohol was better than anything I had ever tasted. Even here, in the darkness, 70 levels below the light, hierarchy and privilege created distinctions between the powerful and the disposable. 5 days later, the Arbites returned with shackles. They chained us together in a line. 15 former gangers who had survived long enough to be considered valuable enough to die somewhere else. The shackles were real metal, not the improvised restraints we used in the Underhive, and they were keyed to a control unit carried by the Arbite's sergeant. If any of us tried to run or fight, the shackles would deliver an electrical charge strong enough to stop a heart. Then they marched us upward. The journey began in familiar territory, the corridors and passages I had known for 20 years. But within an hour we had passed beyond the boundaries of the sump, ascending through sections I had only heard about in stories. The changes were subtle at first. The chem lamps were spaced closer together, providing more consistent light. The walls showed signs of actual maintenance, patches where someone had bothered to seal cracks or reinforce weakened sections. The drip of toxic runoff was less constant, less pervasive. We climbed staircases that must have been built during the Hive's original construction, their steps worn smooth by thousands of years of foot traffic. We passed through chambers that still bore faded imperial markings and motivational slogans in High Gothic. "In service we find purpose. The Emperor protects the faithful." Words that had once meant something to someone, now just ghosts on corroded walls. As we ascended to level 65, the differences became more pronounced. The air tasted less toxic, not clean, not by any standard that mattered, but noticeably less poisonous than what I had breathed every day of my life. The temperature was more stable, less prone to the wild fluctuations that characterized the sump. The smell of decay faded, replaced by the sense of industry and habitation. At level 60, we passed through a section where people actually lived according to something resembling order. Workers in stained coveralls trudged toward manufactorums at the sound of shift change klaxons. They had jobs, Actual employment, not the desperate scavenging and theft that sustained life in the Underhive. They were paid wages, meager as they might be, that allowed them to purchase food from distributors rather than fighting over corpse starch rations. I watched a man stop at a vending terminal and insert a credit chip, receiving a wrapped ration bar in exchange. The transaction took seconds. No violence, no negotiation, no question of whether he would eat that day. He simply exchanged value for goods according to systems that had been functioning for longer than I had been alive. None of these workers looked at us as we passed, or rather they looked through us, their eyes sliding away as if we were not quite real. The Arbites were real, recognizable as authority and threat, but we shackled gangers were something else, something beneath notice. At level 55, we entered residential sections, not the hab holes I had known, where families huddled in spaces barely large enough to lie down, but actual living units with doors that locked. Through open doorways, I glimpsed families eating together at tables, children doing something that might have been homework, couples talking without the constant tension of survival that defined every interaction in the Underhive. Children played in supervised areas, cordoned sections of corridor where they chased each other and laughed under the watchful eyes of adults whose only job seemed to be ensuring their safety. I had not heard children laugh like that in my entire life. In the Underhive, children learned early to be quiet, to avoid attention, to understand that noise could draw predators of both human and inhuman variety. At level 48, I saw my first hydroponic garden, a massive chamber converted into growing space where real vegetables grew under synthetic lights that simulated the sun I had never seen. Tomatoes, lettuce, things I had only encountered as paste in ration bars or abstract concepts in half-remembered lessons. Here they grew in rows, tended by workers who moved through the green spaces with calm efficiency. At level 40, we passed a shrine to the Emperor. Not graffiti sprayed on a wall by someone who barely understood what the Aquila represented, but an actual maintained structure. A chamber set aside specifically for worship, with candles that burned with real flame, with icons that had been carved by skilled hands, with a priest in robes who led a small congregation in prayers that followed actual liturgy rather than half-remembered fragments. Each level revealed more order, more structure, more evidence of a civilization that functioned according to rules and systems I had never imagined existed. And with each level, the weight of understanding grew heavier on my chest. The gang warfare that had defined my existence meant nothing here. The territory I had fought for, that my friends had died for, was invisible to the people living just 30 levels above us. The rust jackals, the scavengers, the sump rats. Names that had seemed so important, so worthy of respect and fear, were utterly unknown to workers who lived close enough to the Underhive that they could have walked there in a day. They did not know we existed. The Imperium had not forgotten us. The Imperium had never known we were there in the first place. My victories were meaningless. The respect I had earned was worthless. Everything I had believed about carving my name into the history of the Underhive was revealed as a child's fantasy, a story we told ourselves to make the grinding violence bearable. There was no history in the Underhive. There was only the endless present, the constant struggle for survival in a place too worthless for the Imperium to properly control. The gang structure that had given my life purpose was not a society, or a brotherhood, or a legacy. It was just a way to organize violence in the forgotten depths, a system that allowed the strong to prey on the weak with slightly more efficiency than pure chaos would allow. Craze was not a leader building something that mattered. He was a survivor who had learned to maintain his position by feeding the machine with other people's lives. Thresh had died for nothing. Jace had bled out in my arms for nothing. Mara had rotted from infection for nothing. The boy with the Aquila tattoo had prayed to the Emperor for protection that never came because the Emperor did not know he existed. The woman shielding her children had died in a territorial dispute that mattered to no one except those already trapped in the same grinding cycle. This realization did not arrive as a moment of dramatic revelation. It accumulated slowly, like the toxic drip from the levels above, each new sight adding another layer of understanding. By the time we reached level 30, I felt crushed under the weight of my own irrelevance. 20 years of life, 4 years of gang warfare, dozens of kills, all of it adding up to nothing except the continuation of violence in a place the Imperium had abandoned to entropy and despair. The shackles pulled at my wrists as we continued climbing, and I wondered if Craze had been right. Perhaps dying in the Imperial Guard would at least serve some purpose, however small. Perhaps the violence that awaited me would matter more than the violence I was leaving behind. But I no longer believed it. The weight only grew heavier as we continued our ascent. At level 10, the architecture changed completely. Gone were the industrial corridors and cramped passages of the lower Hive. Here, the spaces opened up into vast atriums with ceilings that disappeared into shadow above. The walls were decorated with mosaics depicting imperial heroes and holy scenes from the Emperor's crusade across the galaxy. The air was processed through filtration systems that actually worked, removing most of the toxic elements until what remained was merely stale rather than poisonous. We saw people in clothing that was not stained or patched, who walked with posture that spoke of adequate nutrition and lives not defined by constant struggle. They glanced at our shackled line with expressions of distaste and moved on quickly, as if proximity to us might contaminate them. At level 5, we passed through a market district where actual goods were bought and sold. Not scrap and salvage, but manufactured items. Clothing, tools, food that had not been processed into corpse starch paste. The vendors operated from permanent stalls, their wares displayed openly without fear of theft. Arbites patrolled regularly, maintaining order through their mere presence. Then we reached the surface. The Arbites led us through a final set of massive blast doors that must have weighed hundreds of tons, their surfaces marked with purity seals and warding prayers. The doors ground open slowly, and beyond them lay something my mind struggled to process. The sky. I had imagined it countless times during my 20 years in the darkness. I had constructed images based on descriptions from stories and half-remembered lessons. But imagination could not prepare me for the reality. It was vast beyond comprehension, stretching in every direction without walls or ceiling to contain it. A toxic orange haze of industrial pollution obscured whatever lay beyond. But even that poisoned expanse was more open, more infinite than anything I had ever experienced. The stars were invisible through the smog, but I could see the upper spires of other hives in the distance, their peaks crowned with lights that glowed against the orange sky. Kilometers away. Tens of kilometers. Structures so massive they dominated the horizon, each one containing millions of lives stacked in levels that descended into the planet's crust. Wind touched my face for the first time. Actual wind. Moving air that carried the sense of chemical processing and burning promethium, but also carried them away, dispersing them into that vast orange expanse. In the underhive, air was static, stagnant, trapped. Here it moved with purpose, flowing around the hive's upper structures according to patterns I could not predict. I stood there, shackled and staring, until an Arbite's shock maul pressed against my back and forced me forward. They took us to a processing facility on the hive's outer edge, a massive structure of reinforced rockcrete and armored plating. Inside, Thousands of conscripts moved through stations in a continuous flow, being catalogued and prepared for deployment. The scale was staggering. This single facility processed more bodies in a day than had lived in the entire sump level. Here I met soldiers from other parts of the Hive, from other worlds even. Men and women who had been recruited or pressed into service through 100 different mechanisms. And I realized quickly that even among conscripts, even among those selected to die in wars they did not understand, there was hierarchy. Underhive gangers occupied the lowest tier. We were regarded as subhuman by the criminals and debtors who had volunteered to escape prison sentences. We were beneath the notice of those who had enlisted out of desperation or duty. The Munitorum officials who processed us barely registered us as human, checking our teeth and limbs the way one might evaluate livestock, marking our worth with stamps and notations in ledgers we could not read. They issued us equipment that told its own story. Laser guns so old and worn that their casings showed the scars of decades of service. Flak armor that had been patched so many times the original material was barely visible beneath the repairs. The armor was practically useless, its protective qualities degraded by age and damage until it would stop perhaps 1 or 2 impacts before failing completely. Our training consisted of 3 weeks of basic instruction: how to march in formation, how to hold a laser gun, how to shoot in the general direction of the enemy. That was the extent of it. No tactics, no strategy, no understanding of what we would face or how to survive it. We were not being trained as soldiers. We were being processed as ammunition. Then they loaded us onto transport ships. The vessels were massive, bulk carriers designed to move cargo across the void between worlds. We were cargo. They packed us into holds designed for raw materials, cramming bodies into spaces until we stood shoulder to shoulder with barely room to breathe. The air grew thick with the heat of too many people in too small a space. Some died of suffocation before we even left Volg's atmosphere. Others succumbed to disease that spread through the packed crowds with terrifying speed. I managed to position myself near a small viewport, a circle of reinforced glass no larger than my fist. Through it, I watched as we ascended beyond Volg's atmosphere, watched the orange haze give way to the black void of space, and I saw, for the first time, how vast the galaxy truly was. Stars beyond counting scattered across an infinite darkness, nebulae that glowed with their own light, clouds of gas and dust larger than solar systems, other ships moving through the void, their drives leaving trails of light that faded slowly into the black. The scale of it crushed my ability to comprehend. Each point of light was a sun. Each sun likely had worlds. Each world potentially held billions of lives. Volg was one world among millions. Hive Primus was one hive among hundreds on that single world. The Sump was one level among hundreds in that single hive. And the 3 blocks of territory the Rust Jackals controlled was a microscopic fraction of that single level. Everything I had fought for, everyone who had died, all the territory and respect and legacy I had believed mattered. It was all just dust in one forgotten corner of one unimportant world in an imperium that spanned the galaxy. The gang warfare that had consumed my entire existence was invisible even from orbit. Less than invisible. It did not exist in any meaningful sense. It was just violence organizing itself in darkness, consuming lives without purpose or consequence, noticed by no one and mattering to nothing. Thresh and Jace and Mara had died for territory that did not register on any map anyone would ever consult. The water reclamation plant we had taken from the scavengers would eventually break down, and no one would come to repair it, and the gangs would fight over something else until they too died and were replaced by new gangers who would repeat the same pointless cycle. My name would not be carved into the history of the Underhive. There was no history to carve it into. There was only the grinding present, endlessly repeating, until the hive itself eventually collapsed, or the sun burned out, or the Imperium fell, and none of it would matter because it had never mattered in the first place. The weight of my own meaninglessness crushed me more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. I stood at that viewport, staring out at the infinite void, and understood with perfect clarity that I had wasted every moment of my life fighting for things that did not exist. And then there was no more time for contemplation, because we arrived at a world whose name I never learned, and they told us to prepare for deployment. They called the enemy orcs, green-skinned xenos that stood taller than any human, with muscles like bundled cables and tusks that jutted from their lower jaws. They seemed too large to be real, too savage to be anything except nightmares given physical form. But the commissar who briefed us spoke matter-of-factly about their weapons and tactics, as if discussing weather patterns rather than monsters. We deployed via dropships that screamed through the atmosphere with engines that sounded like they were tearing themselves apart. Through the viewports, I caught glimpses of a world that was brown and grey, its surface scarred by artillery and orbital bombardment. Then we hit ground and the ramps dropped, and there was no more time for observation. The battle was chaos from the first moment. Lass fire and explosions and the roar of orcish weapons that fired rounds the size of my fist. The sky above was black with smoke. The ground beneath our feet was mud churned by countless boots and treads, until it had the consistency of corpse starch paste. We advanced because the commissars behind us would shoot anyone who hesitated, and we died because the enemy in front of us had no hesitation at all. I learned later, from a wounded guardsman who had served for 3 years, that our entire regiment had been used as a diversionary force. We were sent forward to draw orcish attention while real guard regiments flanked from another position. Tactical sense, sound strategy. We were ammunition spent to accomplish an objective. Most of us were dead within 3 hours. I found myself in a crater with 5 other survivors, pressed against mud that stank of chemicals and blood. Las bolts streaked overhead in both directions. Orcish slugs tore through the air with sounds like tearing fabric. Around us, the remains of our regiment lay scattered across the battlefield, bodies twisted into positions that no longer resembled anything human. Of the 5 survivors with me, 3 wore colors I recognized. Scavenger colors. One had been sump rats. Another wore the markings of the bone collectors. Back on Volg, in the darkness of the Underhive, we would have been enemies. We would have killed each other without hesitation, for territory or resources, or simply because that was what our gangs demanded. Here, those old rivalries meant nothing. We shared ammunition without discussion, passing power packs between us as they depleted. We watched each other's backs because that was the only way any of us would survive the next 5 minutes. When one of the scavengers took a round to the shoulder, I used strips from my uniform to bind the wound, working with the same desperate efficiency I had learned patching up rust jackals in the aftermath of territorial raids. "Never thought I'd die next to jackal scum," the wounded scavenger said, his voice tight with pain. But there was no real hatred in the words, just exhaustion. "Never thought I'd save a scavenger," I replied, "but here we are." In that moment, pressed into mud on a world I could not name, surrounded by enemies I did not understand, fighting for reasons that had nothing to do with me, I experienced a clarity I had never felt before. I understood, finally, what all violence really was. Desperation. The gang warfare in the Underhive had not been about glory or territory or carving names into history. It had been about survival in a place where survival required taking from others because there was not enough for everyone. We had invented meaning for it, created stories about legacy and brotherhood and respect, because the alternative was admitting that we were just animals fighting over scraps in darkness the Imperium had abandoned. This war was no different. It was not about honor or duty. or serving the Emperor. It was about powerful people using disposable bodies to accomplish their goals. The generals who planned this offensive would survive regardless of how many conscripts died. The administratum officials who had pressed us into service would return to their comfortable positions in the upper hive. The Imperium would continue grinding forward, consuming worlds and lives, because that was what it had been designed to do for 10,000 years. Everything was the same. The scale changed. The enemies changed. The locations changed. But the fundamental truth remained constant. Some lives were considered worthless, and those worthless lives were spent without thought by those in power. I had been worthless in the Underhive. I was worthless here. The only difference was the efficiency with which that worthlessness was converted into death. I was not angry about this. Anger required the belief that things could be different, that some alternative existed if only people would choose it. But there was no alternative. This was the only reality. Violence feeding violence. Consumption feeding consumption. The machine grinding forward forever because nothing could stop it, and no one with power to change it had any reason to do so. The orcs came over the crater's edge in a wave of green flesh and crude weapons. They roared their savage battle cries in a language that sounded like metal grinding against metal. I fired my laser gun until the power pack was exhausted, each shot finding flesh, each impact doing nothing to slow their advance. When the laser gun died, I used it as a club, swinging it into a tusked face with all the strength I had left. The stock shattered. The orc barely noticed. Then I fought with my hands and teeth the way I had learned in the Underhive, where weapons were often lost or broken, and survival depended on the willingness to use anything available. I clawed at eyes and bit at throats, and drove my fingers into any vulnerable point I could reach. The orc's blood was hot and tasted of copper and chemicals, and I knew with perfect certainty that this was how I would die. Not gloriously, not in service of anything that mattered, just violently, desperately, in a crater on a world whose name I had never learned, fighting an enemy I did not understand, serving a system that had never cared if I existed. I died the way I had lived. My last thought was not of the Emperor or duty, or even my dead gang brothers whose faces I could no longer clearly remember. It was a simple recognition, clean and final as a last bolt through the heart. I was always going to die like this. The location did not matter. The enemy did not matter. This was always the only ending available to someone born in the darkness of the Underhive. The machine had consumed me the moment I was born into it, and everything since had just been the slow process of that consumption completing itself. The orc's blade found my chest, and the pain was brief, and then there was nothing at all. The body lay where it fell, among thousands of others scattered across the muddy battlefield. When the orcs were finally driven back and the real guard regiments secured the objective, burial details moved through the carnage with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. But there were too many dead. Too many press-ganged conscripts whose names had never been properly recorded, whose identification tags had been lost or never issued in the first place. The Munitorum made calculations. Resources versus necessity. Fuel for pyres versus transport capacity for the wounded. The dead from proper regiments were collected for burial with honors appropriate to their service. The dead from the diversionary forces were gathered into piles and burned where they lay. The flames consumed what had once been a young man from the Underhive of Hive Primus on the world of Volg, 20 years old, former member of the Rust Jackals, veteran of more battles than most people his age could imagine. His name was never recorded in any official register. His death generated no report beyond a numerical tally in casualty assessments that would be filed and forgotten within days. The smoke from the pyres rose into an alien sky and dispersed into atmosphere that would eventually carry it across continents and oceans. atoms that had once formed flesh and bone and consciousness scattered into the planetary cycle, indistinguishable from any other organic matter being processed by a world that cared nothing for the origins of its component elements. Back on Volg, in the darkness 70 levels below the light, the rust jackals had moved on. Krays was dead. Killed in a leadership challenge 2 months after the press gang had taken 15 of his best fighters. His scarred face, which had survived 3 decades of under-Hive warfare, had not survived the blade of his lieutenant who decided the time had come for new leadership. The body was dumped in the deep sump where the mutants lived, and within a day, there was nothing left to mark that Krays had ever existed except stories that would fade with each retelling until they too disappeared into the darkness. The new leader was younger, hungrier, more vicious. He took the name Razor and immediately launched a new territorial war, this time against the Bone Collectors to the southwest. The pattern repeated with perfect fidelity. Raids, skirmishes, full assaults, territory taken and lost and taken again. Bodies accumulating in the passages and chambers where the gangs contested control of spaces that mattered to no one except those fighting over them. The rust jackals numbered 43 now, exactly the same count as when the press gang had taken their tithe. New recruits had replaced the dead, children from the deep sump who had nowhere else to go, who needed the protection and structure that gang membership provided, who believed that proving themselves through violence would earn them respect and purpose. A boy named Cade, 13 years old, stood in a narrow passage lit by flickering chem lamps. His hands were covered in blood that was not entirely his own. The body of a bone collector lay at his feet, twitching with the last involuntary movements of a nervous system that did not yet understand it was disconnected from life. Cade held a crude auto pistol, feeling its weight, feeling the rush of adrenaline and terror and exhilaration flooding through his system. He had killed someone. He had proven himself. He was blooded now. The older gangers would respect him. His name would be spoken with acknowledgement rather than dismissal. He mattered. Vex emerged from the shadows, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the scene. The scarred enforcer looked at the body, then at Cade, then back at the body. His face split into something that might have been a smile. "Clean work," Vex said, his damaged voice carrying approval. "Razor will want to hear about this." Cade nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He stared at his hands, at the blood drying between his fingers, and felt something he had never experienced before. Purpose. Significance. The belief that this moment marked the beginning of something important, that his life was finally starting to mean something. "First kill," Vex said, and it was not a question. "Remember this feeling. You'll spend the rest of your life chasing it." He moved past Cade, stepping over the body without ceremony, pausing at the edge of the chem lamplight to look back. "You're one of us now," Vex said. "You're a rust jackal. You matter." The words resonated through Cade like the strike of a hammer on metal. He mattered. After 13 years of being nothing, of surviving in the darkness through scavenging and theft and desperation, he had finally proven his worth. He was ascending. His name would be carved into the history of the Underhive. His legacy would endure. He believed it completely, the way young gangers had believed it for generations, the way they would continue to believe it for generations to come. The grinding continued. 70 levels below any natural light, in the constant drip of toxins and the stench of corpse starch and the corroded passages that stretched into absolute darkness, new children were born. They would grow up as Cade was growing up, as the dead ganger from the mud world had grown up before him. They would join gangs because the alternative was death. They would fight for territory that mattered to no one. They would kill and die in the darkness, believing for brief moments that their violence served a purpose, that their names would be remembered, that the machine they fed with their lives was building something rather than simply consuming. None of them knew about the boy who had stood in this same passage 4 years ago, who had felt the same rush after his first kill, who had believed the same promises. None of them would be remembered either. Their names would fade. Their bodies would rot in the passages or be burned in distant pyres on worlds they could not imagine. The territory they died for would change hands and change back, and eventually collapse into the deeper sump where the mutants and the forgotten made their homes. And above them, rising through 70 levels of hab blocks and manufactorums and markets and residential zones, through the privileged spires where natural light touched stone, the Imperium continued, vast and indifferent, built on the bones of countless forgotten souls who had believed, even for a moment, that their violence might matter. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. And for those born in the forgotten depths of Hive worlds, there was not even the comfort of believing that war served a purpose. There was only the grinding, endless, meaningless violence of survival. And then there was nothing at all. The chem lamps flickered, the toxins dripped, the machine consumed, the cycle completed and began again, as it always had and always would, until the Hive collapsed, or the sun died, or the Imperium fell, and none of it would matter because it had never mattered in the first place. In the darkness, Cade cleaned his auto-pistol with reverence and prepared for the battles to come, believing he was building a legacy. He was wrong about everything.